December 23, 1944. A basement in Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Temperature 18 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 American medics crouched in the darkness listening to German voices directly above them, separated by 12 inches of frozen earth and wooden floorboards, while one of their wounded counted his remaining breaths and wondered if morning would come. Private First Class Ralph Henderson was 22 years old. 4 months since landing at Omaha Beach. 2 weeks since entering the Hürtgen Forest with the 4th Infantry Division. 12 hours since taking shrapnel from an 88mm shell that had detonated in the trees above his position, sending metal fragments and wood splinters through his chest and abdomen. His medical pouch contained morphine syrettes, sulfa powder packets, bandages, and a small metal cross his mother had given him before deployment. Nothing that could repair torn organs or stop internal bleeding. The 2 medics with him were Corporal James Kovacs and Private Eugene Mitchell. Kovacs was from Pittsburgh. Steelworker before the war. Mitchell was from rural Alabama. Farm boy who had never seen snow before Europe. Both carried medical supplies. Neither had surgical equipment or blood plasma. Henderson needed a hospital. They were trapped in a basement 400 yards behind German lines with American forces too scattered to mount a rescue operation and German forces too strong to evade. They had been in the basement since 4 o'clock when German artillery had begun shelling the forest and Henderson had been hit during the barrage. Kovacs and Mitchell had dragged him into the abandoned farmhouse, found the basement entrance, descended the stone steps, and pulled the wooden door shut behind them. The house above was damaged but still standing. German soldiers had moved through the area throughout the day, searching buildings, setting up defensive positions, consolidating their hold on this section of forest after pushing American forces back during the night. Now it was 21:30. The Germans were using the house as a command post. Boots moved across the floor overhead. Voices spoke in sharp consonants and hard vowels. A radio crackled with static and messages. The smell of cigarette smoke drifted through gaps in the floorboards. Henderson lay on the basement floor wrapped in his field jacket with Kovacs's jacket spread over his chest for warmth. His breathing was shallow and irregular. His pulse was weak. His skin was gray in the dim light from Mitchell's shielded flashlight. Kovacs checked Henderson's wounds every 30 minutes. The shrapnel had entered below the right ribcage and exited near the spine. Entry wound the size of a quarter. Exit wound the size of a silver dollar. Both wounds were packed with gauze soaked in sulfa powder. Blood had soaked through the gauze 3 times. Each time Kovacs had removed the old bandages and applied fresh ones. Each time there was less blood. Henderson's body was running out. Mitchell watched the basement door. One hand on his M1 carbine. The carbine had 15 rounds in the magazine. If Germans discovered them, 15 rounds would buy maybe 30 seconds before they were overwhelmed. Mitchell had been a medic for 18 months. He had treated hundreds of wounded soldiers. He knew the difference between a wound that could be survived and a wound that could not. Henderson's wound could not be survived without surgery and blood transfusions. Surgery and blood transfusions were not available in a basement behind enemy lines. At 2200 hours, Henderson began shivering. Not from cold. From shock. His body was failing. Kovacs gave him morphine to ease the pain. Henderson's eyes focused briefly on Kovacs's face before closing again. His lips moved but no sound came out. Kovacs leaned close. Henderson whispered something about Kentucky, about horses, about a girl named Sarah. Then his breathing became more labored. The temperature in the basement was dropping. The stone walls held no warmth. Frost formed on the packed earth floor. Mitchell's breath made clouds in the flashlight beam. Kovacs rubbed his hands together to maintain circulation. Henderson had stopped shivering. That was worse than the shivering. It meant his body could no longer generate heat. It meant hypothermia was setting in on top of blood loss and internal injuries. Above them, German voices grew louder. An argument about something. Then silence. Then footsteps moving toward the back of the house. A door opened and closed. More silence. Kovacs looked at Mitchell. Mitchell looked at the basement door. They waited. At 22:30, the basement door opened. Kovacs died without knowing for certain whether Maurer had sacrificed his only blanket to save Henderson. The evidence suggests strongly that Maurer facilitated providing a blanket, but not that the blanket was his personal property. Wehrmacht blankets were military equipment assigned to units, not to individuals. Maurer did not own the blanket. He convinced his unit to use the blanket for an enemy soldier. This was a meaningful choice but not a personal sacrifice of property. What Maurer did sacrifice was his time, his energy, and his health in conditions where he already lacked adequate winter gear. Descending into a freezing basement. Convincing medical personnel to help. Assisting with evacuation. These actions in his weakened state contributed to his pneumonia and death. The blanket was the unit's sacrifice. Maurer's sacrifice was himself. This reframing changes the story's emphasis. The title, "When an Enemy Gave the Only Blanket Left," suggests a dramatic transfer of a scarce resource from one person to another. The reality was more complex. A military unit allocated one of its last blankets to an enemy soldier because one of its members insisted that medical necessity transcended nationality. That member died shortly thereafter from illness worsened by operating without proper winter gear in brutal conditions. The blanket saved Henderson's life. The lack of adequate winter gear ended Maurer's life. No exchange occurred. Maurer did not give Henderson his blanket. Maurer gave Henderson his advocacy, his initiative, and indirectly his health. The blanket was the instrument of compassion. Maurer was the agent. This distinction matters because it shifts focus from the object to the person. Objects have no moral weight. People do. What matters is not that a blanket was provided but that Maurer ensured it was provided despite personal cost. Henderson never knew this. He knew he had been wounded, captured, treated, and survived. He knew Germans had saved his life. He did not know which Germans or how or why. He spent 29 years after the war living with gratitude for unknown benefactors. He told his family he wished he could thank them. He never could. Maurer was dead 45 years before Henderson died. No meeting was possible. No thanks could be given. The debt remained forever unpaid. But debts of gratitude are not meant to be paid. They are meant to be acknowledged and remembered. Henderson acknowledged his debt by telling his story. His daughter remembered by researching and writing about it. His grandson remembered by visiting Maurer's grave. These acts do not repay what Maurer did. They honor it. Honor is what the dead receive when the living refuse to let their actions be forgotten. The Hürtgen Forest campaign achieved no significant strategic objectives. American forces took the forest at enormous cost. Then winter halted operations. When fighting resumed in spring 1945, the forest was bypassed. Thousands died for terrain that ultimately did not matter. Military historians consider the Hürtgen Forest campaign one of the most futile battles of the Western Front. Resources were wasted. Lives were spent unnecessarily. Nothing permanent was gained. But individual moments within futile campaigns are not themselves futile. Henderson's life was saved. Maurer's character was revealed. Kovacs's conscience was tested. Mitchell's professionalism was demonstrated. These outcomes had meaning regardless of the campaign's strategic failure. Human value exists independently of military success. This is what war memorials often miss. They focus on victory and defeat, on nations and armies. They miss the basement moments where one person helps another because it is the right thing to do. The farmhouse where Henderson lay dying no longer exists. It was destroyed during the fighting or demolished afterward. The basement is gone. No marker indicates where it stood. The forest has reclaimed the land. If you walked through that section of the Hürtgen today, you would see only trees and undergrowth. Nothing suggests that on December 23, 1944, 3 American medics waited in darkness while one of them counted his remaining breaths and a young German soldier without a coat descended into the cold carrying a lantern and a choice. That choice echoes now only in words written by people who were not there, based on memories of people who could not remember clearly, assembled by researchers who could not find definitive proof. The story survives through layers of uncertainty and reconstruction. But uncertainty does not make it false. The essential facts are documented. Henderson was wounded. Germans treated him. He survived. Maurer helped. Maurer died. The blanket was the last one available. These facts combine to create meaning even if the precise sequence and motivation remain unclear. The blanket that saved Henderson's life exists now only as an entry in a German supply record. One blanket used December 23 to 24, 1944. No description. No serial number. No indication of what became of it afterward. It was a standard Wehrmacht medical blanket, gray wool, roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, manufactured in 1943 or 1944 by a German textile company whose records no longer exist. Thousands of identical blankets were produced during the war. Most were lost or destroyed. A few survive in museums and private collections. But this specific blanket is gone. Mauer is buried in the German military cemetery at Wassenach, Section 4, Row 12, Grave 8. His gravestone is simple granite, standard Wehrmacht issue, 18 inches tall and 12 inches wide. It lists his name, rank, birth date, and death date. Nothing indicates he was a teacher or that he saved an enemy soldier. The grave is maintained by the German War Graves Commission. It is visited occasionally by tourists and researchers. Henderson's daughter visited in 2001. Henderson's grandson visited in 2015. Others may have visited. The cemetery keeps no visitor logs. Henderson is buried in a small cemetery in Kentucky near where he grew up. His gravestone mentions his military service, his Silver Star for valor, and his Purple Heart for wounds received in action. It does not mention being saved by German soldiers. His wife Sarah is buried beside him. She died in 2008, 35 years after Henderson. Together they had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 13 great-grandchildren. None of these descendants exist because Mauer descended into a basement on December 23, 1944, and convinced a medic to provide treatment. This is how history works. Small actions create cascading consequences. If Mauer had not helped Henderson, Henderson dies in the basement or during the night. No recovery. No return home. No marriage to Sarah. No children. 3 entire family lines do not exist. The ripple effects extend to friends, colleagues, neighbors, anyone whose life was touched by Henderson or his descendants. Mauer's 5-minute decision in a freezing basement shaped dozens of lives across 3 generations. Mauer's own family line ended with him. He was engaged but never married. He had no children. His parents died in the 1950s. His fiancée married someone else in 1947. His branch of the Mauer family ceased. This was common in Germany after the war. Millions of men died. Millions of family lines ended. The demographic impact lasted decades. Germany lost not just people but potential people, all the children and grandchildren who would have been born if their ancestors had survived. So what remains is imbalance. Henderson's line continues. Mauer's line does not. This is not justice or injustice. It is simply what happened. War is not fair. Survival is not distributed according to merit. Henderson was not more deserving of life than Mauer. Mauer was not more deserving of death than Henderson. Both were young men in situations they did not choose, making decisions they believed were right. One survived. One did not. What remains is memory, and memory is selective. We remember what we choose to remember. Henderson's family chose to remember his courage and survival. Kovacs chose to remember the German soldier who helped. Mauer's family, if they remember him, remember a son and brother lost too young. None of these memories is complete. All are shaped by time, emotion, and the need to make sense of senseless events. What remains is also absence. The absence of all the conversations Henderson and Mauer never had. The absence of the gratitude Henderson could never express. The absence of the explanation Mauer could never provide. These absences are as much a part of the story as the documented facts. They represent all the understanding that war prevents. The what-ifs and might-have-beens. The connections severed by violence and chance. The last thing that remains is the question Kovacs asked and never fully answered. Why? Why did Mauer help Henderson? We have evidence suggesting compassion. We have context suggesting duty. We have outcomes suggesting both. But we do not have Mauer's own words explaining his thinking. We can construct narratives. We can cite evidence. We can make educated guesses. But we cannot know with certainty what Mauer was thinking when he descended those basement stairs. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the unanswerable question is the point. Mauer's motivation matters less than his action. He acted. Henderson lived. The blanket was given. These facts stand regardless of internal motivation. In the end, what matters is not why Mauer helped but that he did. Intention is invisible. Behavior is observable. We judge people by what they do, not by what they think. Mauer's thoughts died with him. His actions survived in documents and memories and eventually in these words. On December 23, 1944, somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest, a German soldier without a winter coat descended into a freezing basement, found 3 American medics with a dying wounded man, and chose to help rather than ignore. That choice, small and unremarkable at the time, echoes through decades. It survived in Kovacs's memory, Henderson's gratitude, Bergman's research, and the continued existence of Henderson's descendants. It survived because people refused to let it disappear into history's vast silence. The farmhouse is gone. The basement is gone. The blanket is gone. Mauer is gone. Henderson is gone. Kovacs is gone. Mitchell is gone. Almost everyone who was present that night is dead now. But the moment itself remains preserved in imperfect form through accumulated testimony and research. Not as complete truth but as truth enough. Enough to know that on one frozen night in the worst winter of the century's worst war, one person helped another across the line that separated enemies. That is what remains. One German soldier without a coat. One American soldier who lived because of a blanket. One moment of compassion that made no difference to the war's outcome but all the difference to the lives it touched. The blanket was the last one left. It was given to someone who needed it. And that small act of medical necessity and human decency is now the only part of that night that will not be forgotten as long as someone chooses to remember it. December 23, 1944. A basement. A lantern. 3 Americans. 1 German. One choice. What remains is the echo of what we choose to do when no one is watching except those who depend on us. Mauer was watching himself. Henderson's life hung on what Mauer decided in that moment. And Mauer decided that life mattered more than nationality, that need mattered more than orders, that a man freezing and bleeding in a basement deserved help even if that man wore the wrong uniform. The blanket was gray wool, standard issue, nothing special. It was the only one left in a supplies list that had once held 200. It was wrapped around Ralph Henderson on a December night and carried him through cold that should have killed him. It was just a blanket. But in that moment, under those circumstances, with those stakes, it was everything. Light from a kerosene lantern spilled down the stone steps. A German soldier descended slowly, one hand on the wooden railing, the other holding the lantern. He wore the standard Wehrmacht uniform of the Western Front. Gray-green wool tunic. Black leather boots. Steel helmet. He was young, maybe 24 or 25. Clean-shaven. Thin face. Blue eyes that widened when the lantern light revealed 3 American soldiers in the basement. Kovacs raised his hands. Mitchell did the same. Neither moved toward their weapons. The German soldier looked at them for several seconds without speaking. Then he looked at Henderson lying motionless on the floor wrapped in 2 field jackets. He set the lantern on the bottom step. Removed his rifle from his shoulder and leaned it against the wall. Knelt beside Henderson. The German spoke no English. Kovacs spoke no German. But medical terminology crosses language barriers. The German pointed at Henderson's wounds. Made a questioning gesture with his hands. Kovacs pulled back the field jackets to reveal the blood-soaked bandages. The German examined the entry and exit wounds without touching them. Nodded slowly. Looked at Kovacs and Mitchell. Pointed upward toward the house. Kovacs did not understand. The German repeated the gesture. Pointed at Henderson. Pointed upward. Made a carrying motion with his hands. Kovacs understood. The German was offering to take Henderson upstairs. To the German command post. To German medical personnel. Kovacs looked at Mitchell. Mitchell shook his head slightly. Upstairs meant capture. Capture meant prisoner of war camps. Prisoner of war camps meant uncertain medical care and uncertain survival. But staying in the basement meant certain death. Kovacs pointed at Henderson. Made a questioning gesture. The German nodded. Repeated the carrying motion. Then he stood and climbed back up the stairs. His boots disappeared through the doorway. The door remained open. Light from the house filled the stairwell. Kovacs and Mitchell waited in silence. Henderson's breathing grew more shallow. 5 minutes passed. Then the German returned with another soldier. The second soldier was older, maybe 40. Sergeant's insignia on his collar. Medic's armband on his left sleeve. The medic descended the stairs carrying a canvas medical bag. He knelt beside Henderson. Opened the bag. Removed bandages, sulfa powder, a stethoscope, morphine ampoules. The medic examined Henderson's wounds with professional efficiency. Lifted his eyelids to check pupil response. Felt his pulse. Listened to his chest with the stethoscope. Checked the wound dressings. Then he looked at Kovacs and spoke in German. Kovacs did not understand the words but understood the tone. The medic was explaining what needed to happen next. The medic pointed upstairs again. Pointed at Henderson. Made the carrying motion. Kovacs nodded. The medic and the first soldier prepared to lift Henderson. They removed the field jackets. Worked their arms under his shoulders and legs. Lifted him gently. Henderson moaned but did not regain consciousness. They carried him toward the stairs. Kovacs started to follow. The medic turned and shook his head. Pointed at Kovacs and Mitchell. Made a staying motion with his hand. They were to remain in the basement. The two Germans carried Henderson up the stairs. The young soldier returned for the lantern. Looked at Kovacs and Mitchell one more time. Then he climbed the stairs and closed the door. Darkness returned to the basement. Kovacs and Mitchell sat in silence. Above them, German voices spoke rapidly. Boots moved across the floor. A vehicle engine started outside. The sound faded into the distance. Henderson was gone. Mitchell turned on his flashlight. Pointed it at the floor where Henderson had been lying. Blood stained the earth. Kovacs's field jacket lay abandoned. Mitchell picked it up. Felt its weight. The jacket was soaked with blood and cold. He folded it carefully and set it aside. Then he looked at Kovacs. Neither man spoke. What was there to say? They waited in the basement for 3 hours. During that time, German soldiers moved through the house periodically. None opened the basement door. At 2 o'clock, the activity above ceased. The house fell silent. Kovacs checked his watch. Mitchell checked the basement door. Still closed. Still no sound from above. They decided to risk it. They had no medical supplies left to justify staying. Henderson was either being treated or was already dead. Either way, they could not help him from a basement. Mitchell opened the door slowly. Peered up the stairs. Darkness. No light. No voices. He climbed the stairs with Kovacs following. They moved through the abandoned house. The German command post had been evacuated. Maps remained on tables. A radio sat silent in the corner. Cigarette butts filled an ashtray. But no soldiers. The Germans had moved on. Kovacs and Mitchell exited through the back door into the frozen forest. American lines were somewhere to the west. They began walking. The Hürtgen Forest campaign continued through January 1945. American casualties exceeded 33,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. German casualties were similar. The forest itself was destroyed by months of shelling and fighting. Trees were reduced to splinters. The ground was cratered and churned. Snow fell and covered the devastation with white silence. Kovacs and Mitchell reached American lines on December 24 at 6:30. They reported to their battalion medical officer. Explained what had happened to Henderson. The officer noted Henderson as missing in action. MIA was better than confirmed Kia. MIA meant there was a chance he had survived German captivity. MIA meant his family would receive notification that he was missing rather than dead. It was a small mercy. Kovacs returned to duty on December 26, Mitchell returned on December 27. Both continued serving as medics through the remainder of the war. Kovacs treated hundreds more wounded soldiers. Mitchell did the same. They never spoke about the basement or about Henderson or about the German soldier who had taken him. It was not something medics discussed. They saw too many wounded to dwell on individual cases. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Kovacs was in Bavaria when Germany surrendered. Mitchell was in Austria. Both survived. Both returned home. Kovacs went back to Pittsburgh and his job at the steel mill. Mitchell went back to Alabama and his family farm. They did not stay in contact. War friendships rarely survived the return to civilian life. In June 1945, as prisoner of war camps across Germany were liberated and processed, the U.S. Army began compiling lists of American POWs who had survived German captivity. The lists were cross-referenced with missing in action reports. Families were notified when soldiers previously listed as MIA were found alive. On June 23, 1945, Kovacs received a letter from the War Department. Private First Class Ralph Henderson had been located at a hospital in Bavaria recovering from wounds received in December 1944. The letter included Henderson's current address and a note that he was expected to make a full recovery. Kovacs read the letter 3 times. Then he wrote to Henderson. Mitchell did the same after Kovacs sent him Henderson's address. Henderson replied to both letters in August. His letter was brief. 2 pages. He remembered being wounded. He remembered voices in the darkness. He did not remember the German soldiers taking him from the basement. His next clear memory was waking up in a German field hospital 3 days later. The German field hospital had been staffed by Wehrmacht medical personnel treating both German and Allied wounded. Henderson had undergone surgery to repair internal damage. He had received blood transfusions. He had been given morphine for pain and sulfa drugs to prevent infection. The German surgeons had saved his life. After recovering enough to be moved, he had been transferred to a prisoner of war camp near Munich. Conditions in the camp were poor but not brutal. Food was scarce. Medical care was minimal. But he had survived until liberation. Henderson's letter raised a question that Kovacs had been avoiding since December 23. Why had the German soldier helped them? Why had the medic treated Henderson? Why had they evacuated an enemy soldier from the basement and provided medical care when they could have simply left him to die or shot all 3 Americans and eliminated potential witnesses to their position? The question had no clear answer. German treatment of prisoners varied widely depending on circumstances, unit, location, and individual soldiers involved. Some German units followed Geneva Convention protocols. Others did not. The Eastern Front was notorious for brutality on both sides. The Western Front was generally less brutal but not uniformly humane. American soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge reported mixed treatment. Some were treated well. Others were executed. The German soldier who had descended the basement stairs on December 23 had made a choice. He could have reported the Americans to his superiors and allowed others to decide their fate. He could have ignored them and left them to freeze or bleed out. He could have shot them and claimed self-defense. Instead, he had recognized Henderson's condition, assessed the situation, and sought help. The medic who had followed had done the same. They had prioritized medical necessity over military advantage. This was not unique behavior. Medical personnel on both sides often treated enemy wounded despite the risks and despite their own side's propaganda portraying the enemy as subhuman. The Hippocratic tradition of treating all injured regardless of affiliation persisted even in total war. But it was also not universal behavior. Many wounded soldiers died because enemy medics chose not to help or were prevented from helping by their own officers or by tactical situations that made treatment impossible. The Germans who helped Henderson had risked court-martial for aiding the enemy. They had used medical resources on an American that could have been used on German wounded. They had revealed their command post location to American soldiers who might have escaped and reported it. None of these risks had deterred them. They had acted as medics first and soldiers second. That distinction mattered. Kovacs wanted to find the German soldier who had opened the basement door. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to understand the thinking behind the choice. But finding one German soldier from one night in the Hürtgen Forest was impossible. The Wehrmacht had been destroyed. Records were scattered or destroyed. Millions of German soldiers were dead, missing, or displaced. The young soldier with the lantern and blue eyes had disappeared into history's chaos. Mitchell did not share Kovacs's need for answers. For Mitchell, the explanation was simple. The German had been a decent man who had done the right thing. War did not eliminate decency. It tested it. Some men passed the test. Others failed. The German soldier had passed. That was enough. Mitchell went on with his life. He married. Had children. Worked his farm. He told his children about the war but not about that night in the basement. Some stories were too complicated to explain. Henderson recovered fully from his wounds. He returned to Kentucky in September 1945. He married Sarah, the girl he had whispered about while dying in the basement. They had 3 children. He never worked again as a medic. He could not bear the thought of treating wounded after what he had experienced. Instead, he worked in his father's hardware store. Lived a quiet life. He told his children about being wounded and captured but not about the basement or the German soldiers who had saved him. That part was private. What was lost in the Hürtgen Forest was not counted in casualty reports. The forest itself was lost. Before the battle, it had been ancient woodland, dense with fir and spruce, dark even in daylight, quiet except for wind and birds. After the battle, it was a wasteland. Trees were shattered. The ground was poisoned by explosives. Wildlife had fled or died. The forest would not recover for decades. What was lost among the soldiers was harder to quantify. Men who entered the forest believing in clear distinctions between friend and enemy emerged with more complicated understanding. The Germans were not monsters. The Americans were not saints. Everyone was cold, hungry, scared, and dying. The moral clarity of 1941 had eroded by 1944. What remained was survival and small acts of compassion that made no strategic difference but made all the difference to the individuals involved. Kovacs thought about this often after the war. He had entered the war with certainty about its necessity. Germany had to be defeated. Hitler had to be stopped. The cause was just. He still believed these things after the war. But he also believed the German soldier in the basement had been a good man. These beliefs coexisted without contradiction. War was necessary. The enemy was still human. Both could be true. The night of December 23, 1944, remained vivid in Kovacs's memory for the rest of his life. Not because it was traumatic, though it was. Not because Henderson survived, though that mattered. But because of a detail he had not mentioned in his letters to Henderson or Mitchell. A detail he had noticed but not processed until years later when he had time to reflect on what had happened. When the young German soldier had descended into the basement and set down the lantern to examine Henderson, Kovacs had noticed something about his uniform. The soldier was not wearing a coat. He had descended into the freezing basement in his tunic without winter gear despite the temperature being 18 degrees. Kovacs had assumed the soldier had removed his coat upstairs and would retrieve it later. But when the soldier returned to carry Henderson upstairs, he still wore no coat. Only his tunic. Kovacs had been too focused on Henderson to think about this at the time. But decades later, the detail returned to him. He mentioned it to his wife one evening in 1963. She asked if perhaps the German soldier had given his coat to someone. Kovacs had no answer. The question sat with him. He wrote to Mitchell asking if he remembered whether the German had worn a coat. Mitchell wrote back that he did not recall. He suggested Kovacs let it go. But Kovacs could not. In 1967, Kovacs attended a reunion of veterans from the 4th Infantry Division. He mentioned the incident to other medics who had served in the Hürtgen Forest. Several men shared similar stories. German medics treating American wounded. German soldiers sharing food with American prisoners. Small acts of humanity in an inhumane situation. One veteran mentioned that German winter gear had been in short supply by December 1944. Many German soldiers froze to death that winter because they lacked proper coats. The thought formed slowly in Kovacs's mind. The German soldier who had helped Henderson might have given his coat to someone else before descending into the basement. Or he might have given it to Henderson after carrying him upstairs. Or he might have simply not had a coat because German supply lines were collapsing and winter gear was not reaching frontline units. Kovacs had no way to know which explanation was correct. But the possibility that the German had given his only coat to an enemy soldier would not leave him alone. Henderson died in 1973 from heart failure unrelated to his war wounds. Kovacs attended the funeral in Kentucky. He met Sarah and Henderson's 3 children. He told them their father had been a brave man and a good medic. He did not tell them about the German soldier or the coat. It seemed like speculation without proof. But at the cemetery, watching Henderson's coffin being lowered into the ground, Kovacs wished he knew the answer. Mitchell died in 1981. Kovacs was too ill to attend the funeral but sent a letter to Mitchell's family. In the letter, he mentioned the night in the basement and thanked Mitchell for his service. Mitchell's son wrote back that his father had spoken about the war only occasionally but had once mentioned that the Germans had been professional when handling Henderson. Professional was Mitchell's word for decent. It was the highest praise he gave. In 1989, Kovacs was 67 years old and retired from the steel mill. His health was declining. He had emphysema from years of industrial work. His doctors gave him 5 years at most. He decided to spend his remaining time attempting to answer the question that had occupied him for 45 years. He began researching German records from the Hürtgen Forest campaign. The task was overwhelming. German military records from late 1944 were incomplete. Many had been destroyed in the war's final months. Others were scattered across archives in Germany, Russia, and the United States. Kovacs wrote letters to the German Military Archive in Freiburg. He wrote to the U.S. National Archives. He wrote to veteran organizations in Germany. Most replies were polite but unhelpful. Too much time had passed. Too many records were lost. In January 1991, Kovacs received a letter from a German historian named Klaus Bergmann who specialized in Wehrmacht medical units. Bergmann had received Kovacs's inquiry through a veteran organization. He was interested in the story. He asked for more details. Kovacs provided everything he remembered. The date. The approximate location. Henderson's injuries. The 2 German soldiers. The basement. The evacuation. Bergmann replied 6 weeks later. He had found references to an American prisoner of war admitted to a German field hospital near Hürtgen on December 24, 1944, with abdominal wounds requiring surgery. The prisoner's identification matched Henderson's name and service number. The field hospital records indicated the prisoner had been brought in by a frontline unit that was rotating out of the forest that night. The records did not include names of the soldiers who had transported the prisoner. Bergmann included a footnote. The field hospital that treated Henderson had been staffed partially by personnel from a Wehrmacht medical company that had been operating in the Hürtgen Forest since November 1944. The company's records showed that it had lost 40% of its personnel to combat injuries and illness by December. The remaining medics were treating casualties under severe resource constraints. Winter coats were in critical shortage across the entire unit. The footnote confirmed nothing definitively. But it established that the German soldiers who had helped Henderson were likely operating without adequate winter gear themselves. If the young soldier Kovacs remembered had indeed lacked a coat, it was not by choice. It was because there were no coats available. And if he had possessed a coat, giving it away to an enemy soldier would have been an extraordinary sacrifice given the cold and the likelihood he would not receive a replacement. Kovacs wrote back to Bergmann thanking him for the research. He asked if Bergmann could identify the specific soldiers involved. Bergmann replied that this was impossible. The medical company's personnel records were incomplete. The frontline unit that had been in that sector on December 23 could have been any of 3 different battalions. Even if the battalion could be identified, finding surviving soldiers who remembered one American prisoner among hundreds of casualties they handled that winter was unlikely. Kovacs accepted this. He had not expected to find the German soldier. He had only hoped to understand what had happened. Bergmann's research provided that understanding. The Germans had been medics doing their job under impossible conditions. They had treated Henderson because that was their duty. If they had given him a coat, it had been an act of compassion but not necessarily an unusual one. Medical personnel often gave their own equipment to wounded patients when supplies ran short. What made the act significant was not its uniqueness but its ordinariness. Thousands of medics on both sides made similar choices throughout the war. They shared their limited resources with wounded enemies. They risked their own safety to provide care. They maintained professional standards even when their governments and commanders treated the opposing side as subhuman. These acts were not celebrated or recorded. They happened in basements and field hospitals and aid stations where no one was watching except the dying and those trying to save them. Kovacs died in December 1993, 2 weeks after his 71st birthday. His wife found his correspondence with Bergman among his papers. She read through the letters. She did not understand why this question had mattered so much to her husband. But she respected that it had. She wrote to Bergman informing him of Kovacs's death and thanking him for his assistance. Bergman wrote back expressing condolences and including one final piece of information. After Kovacs's initial inquiry, Bergman had continued researching the Hürtgen Forest medical operations. He had found a memoir written by a German medic who had served in the area during December 1944. The memoir was unpublished, held in a private collection, written in the 1960s but never released. Bergman had been granted access to read it for his research. One passage in the memoir described treating an American prisoner with abdominal wounds on December 23 or 24. The medic did not remember the prisoner's name but remembered that the prisoner had been brought from a basement in an abandoned farmhouse. The passage continued. The medic wrote that the soldier who had found the American had been a private named Friedrich Mauer from Stuttgart. Mauer had been 25 years old. He had trained as a schoolteacher before the war. He had been drafted in 1943 and assigned to infantry. He had survived the Normandy campaign and the retreat across France. By December 1944, he was one of the few soldiers in his unit who had not been killed or seriously wounded. The medic's memoir included one more detail. Mauer had given his winter coat to another soldier in his unit 3 days before finding the American in the basement. The other soldier had lost his coat during an artillery barrage and was suffering from frostbite. Mauer had given him his coat and worn only his tunic for the remainder of the week. He had contracted pneumonia by December 26. He had died in a field hospital on December 30. Bergman's letter concluded with this information and an observation. If Mauer was the soldier Kovacs remembered, then Kovacs had been correct about the missing coat. But Mauer had not given the coat to Henderson. He had given it to a fellow German soldier days earlier and simply had no coat when he found the Americans. This did not diminish what he had done. If anything, it emphasized it. Mauer had descended into a freezing basement without proper winter gear to help enemy soldiers while he himself was likely already sick and freezing. Kovacs's wife read Bergman's letter several times. She set it aside. Then she retrieved it and read it again. Something troubled her about the narrative. She had heard Kovacs tell the story dozens of times over the years. He had always mentioned that Henderson had been wrapped in field jackets for warmth. Kovacs's jacket. Mitchell's jacket. But Henderson had been wearing his own jacket initially. 3 jackets total. When the Germans carried Henderson upstairs, they had removed the jackets. Kovacs had specifically remembered this because he had gotten his jacket back and found it soaked with blood. If Mauer had no coat, and if Henderson had been wrapped in 3 jackets, then how had Henderson stayed warm during transport to the field hospital? December nights in the Hürtgen Forest averaged 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Moving a critically wounded patient through freezing temperatures without adequate covering would have worsened his shock and potentially killed him. The Germans would have known this. They were medical personnel. They would have ensured Henderson was wrapped in something during transport. Kovacs's wife wrote to Bergman raising this question. Bergman replied that the memoir did not include this level of detail about Henderson's transport. However, standard Wehrmacht protocol required wounded to be kept warm during evacuation. If no blankets were available, soldiers typically used whatever was at hand. Coats, tents, ground sheets, anything that could provide insulation. Bergman suggested that if Mauer had no coat, another soldier might have provided covering for Henderson. This answer did not satisfy Kovacs's wife. She wrote to Bergman again. She explained that Kovacs had been obsessed with understanding whether the German soldier had sacrificed something personal to help Henderson. The coat had been the obvious answer. But if Mauer had no coat to give, perhaps he had given something else. She asked if Bergman could determine what materials the Germans had available that night. Bergman spent 3 months researching this question. His reply arrived in June 1994. He had found additional records from the Wehrmacht medical company that operated in the Hürtgen Forest. Supply inventories from late December 1944 showed critical shortages of medical supplies, food, ammunition, and winter gear. One item in particular was in severe shortage: blankets. The medical company had been issued 200 wool blankets in November. By December 23, only 18 blankets remained. Most had been used as litters to carry wounded when stretchers were unavailable. Others had been cut up for bandages when gauze ran out. The inventory record from December 24 showed one fewer blanket than December 23, 17 blankets. One had been used during the previous 24 hours. Bergman noted that while this proved nothing definitively, it suggested that a blanket might have been used to transport Henderson. If standard protocol was followed, the blanket would have been wrapped around Henderson during transport and would have remained with him when he arrived at the field hospital. Bergman concluded his letter with a hypothesis. If Maurer had indeed been the soldier who found Henderson, and if Maurer had no coat because he had given it away days earlier, and if blankets were severely limited, then Maurer's act of bringing medical help to Henderson had required asking his unit medic to provide one of the last remaining blankets for an enemy soldier. This would have been a significant request. Each blanket was needed for German wounded. Using one for an American meant one fewer for their own men. Whether the medic agreed immediately or whether Maurer had to persuade him was unknown. But the blanket had been used. The inventory confirmed this. Henderson had been evacuated wrapped in German medical supply that was desperately needed by German casualties. Someone had made the decision that saving Henderson's life justified depleting their limited resources. That someone was likely Maurer or the medic who accompanied him. Kovacs's wife filed Bergman's letters with her husband's papers. She understood now what Kovacs had been searching for. Not proof of heroism. Not evidence of exceptional virtue. Simply confirmation that one human being had recognized another's need and acted on it despite cost and risk. The blanket was that confirmation. It was the only one left. It had been given to an enemy. And the German soldier who facilitated this had died 5 days later from illness contracted while doing his duty without proper winter gear. In 1997, Henderson's daughter published a book about her father's war experiences. The book was based on interviews she had conducted with him before his death in 1973. One chapter covered his wounding and capture in the Hürtgen Forest. Henderson had told his daughter that he remembered very little from that night but had been informed by American medics after the war that German soldiers had saved his life. He had always wanted to thank them but never had the opportunity. Henderson's daughter included in her book a section on German medical treatment of Allied prisoners. She cited statistics showing that Allied prisoners who received medical care from German medical personnel had survival rates comparable to those treated by Allied medics. This contrasted sharply with German treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front where survival rates were catastrophically low. The difference reflected policy differences between theaters and the relative adherence to Geneva Convention protocols on the Western Front versus the Eastern Front. The book included no mention of Maurer or the blanket. Henderson's daughter had no access to this information. Kovacs had died 4 years earlier. Mitchell had died 16 years earlier. The story existed only in Bergman's letters to Kovacs's wife and in the unpublished German memoir. Neither was widely known. Henderson's daughter sent a copy of her book to Kovacs's wife as a courtesy since her father had mentioned Kovacs in his interviews. Kovacs's wife read the book. Then she wrote to Henderson's daughter explaining what Bergman had discovered about the German soldier and the blanket. Henderson's daughter wrote back asking permission to include this information in future editions of her book. Kovacs's wife agreed on condition that Bergman be credited for the research. Henderson's daughter contacted Bergman directly. Bergman provided copies of the relevant documents and memoir excerpts. In 1999, a revised edition of Henderson's daughter's book was published including a new chapter titled The Last Blanket. The chapter detailed Maurer's role in Henderson's rescue and the resource constraints that made giving a blanket to an enemy soldier a meaningful sacrifice. The book attracted modest attention. It was reviewed in military history journals and some newspapers. Several veterans wrote to Henderson's daughter sharing similar stories of German medics treating Allied wounded. One letter came from a veteran who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge and treated at a German field hospital. He described the German medics as exhausted, undersupplied, and overwhelmed but still professional and humane. He mentioned that blankets had been so scarce that wounded soldiers often shared blankets or went without. Another letter came from a German veteran who had served as a medic in the Hürtgen Forest. He did not remember Maurer specifically but remembered the unit and the conditions. He confirmed that by December 1944, medical supplies were critically low. He also confirmed that Wehrmacht medical personnel were instructed to treat all wounded regardless of nationality. This instruction came from medical officers, not from high command. It reflected the medical profession's ethics rather than military policy. The German veteran's letter included an observation that stayed with Henderson's daughter. He wrote that the worst part of serving as a medic in late 1944 was not the danger or the cold or the lack of supplies. It was the knowledge that they could not save everyone. Choices had to be made about who received treatment first, who received limited resources, who was evacuated and who remained. These choices haunted medics for the rest of their lives. The fact that Maurer and his unit medic chose to help Henderson despite the resource constraints spoke to their character but also their burden. By 2000, Henderson's daughter had collected dozens of letters from veterans sharing stories about German medics. She compiled them into a second book published in 2002 titled Winter Care. The book examined German medical treatment of Allied prisoners on the Western Front during winter 1944 to 1945. It included statistical analysis, memoir excerpts, and interviews with surviving veterans from both sides. The book's thesis was that despite Germany's criminal regime and genocidal policies, individual German medics often maintained professional ethics and treated enemy wounded with the same care they gave their own soldiers. The book was controversial. Some reviewers argued it downplayed German atrocities by focusing on isolated acts of decency. Others argued it provided necessary nuance to understanding individual behavior within an evil system. Military historians generally received it well. It won an award from the Society for Military History in 2003. Henderson's daughter donated proceeds from the book to medical charity organizations in both the United States and Germany. Maurer's name appeared prominently in the book. A full chapter was dedicated to the night of December 23 and the decision to help Henderson. Henderson's daughter had obtained Maurer's service record from German archives. He had been drafted in April 1943 at age 24. He had completed basic training in June 1943. He had been assigned to the 275th Infantry Division and sent to Normandy in March 1944. He had survived D-Day and the Normandy fighting. He had been wounded twice, once in July and once in September, both times minor shrapnel wounds. By November 1944, Maurer was one of approximately 80 soldiers remaining from his original company of 200. The others were dead, missing, or seriously wounded. His company had been pulled back to refit in early December but was sent back to the Hürtgen Forest on December 18 when German forces began their counteroffensive. He had been in the forest 5 days when he descended into the basement and found 3 American medics. Maurer's service record ended with a notation that he died of pneumonia on December 30, 1944. He was buried in a military cemetery near Düren. His parents were notified on January 15, 1945. They received his personal effects in February 1945. The effects included letters from home, a prayer book, a photograph of his fiancée, and a teaching certificate from Stuttgart University. Nothing indicated he had saved an American soldier's life. Henderson's daughter visited Maurer's grave in 2001. She placed flowers and a note explaining that her father had survived the war because of Maurer's actions. She took photographs. She sent copies to Kovacs' wife and to Bergman. Kovacs' wife died 3 months later at age 81. Her obituary mentioned that her husband had been a World War II veteran who spent his retirement researching an act of kindness by a German soldier. The obituary included a line stating that her husband had found what he was looking for. The question that Kovacs had spent decades trying to answer was ultimately unanswerable in the way he had hoped. He wanted to know why Maurer had helped Henderson. He wanted to understand the thinking and the motivation. But Maurer was dead. His thoughts died with him. What remained were facts. Maurer had no coat because he had given it to another soldier. Maurer descended into a freezing basement without winter gear. Maurer brought medical help for an enemy soldier. Maurer's unit gave Henderson a blanket they desperately needed. Maurer died 6 days later from illness likely worsened by exposure to cold. These facts suggested compassion, but they did not prove it. They could also suggest duty. Wehrmacht medical personnel were instructed to treat all wounded. Maurer and his unit medic might have been following orders rather than following conscience. They might have treated Henderson because regulations required it, not because humanity demanded it. The difference mattered philosophically but not practically. Henderson survived either way. The outcome was identical regardless of motivation. But motivation does matter for understanding what happened in that basement on December 23, 1944. If Maurer acted from duty alone, his behavior was professional but not extraordinary. Military medics treating enemy wounded was standard practice when circumstances allowed. If Maurer acted from compassion, his behavior reflected personal choice that transcended policy. The distinction between following rules and choosing mercy defines the difference between competence and character. The evidence leans toward character. Maurer had already given away his coat days before. This suggests habitual generosity rather than calculated duty. Descending into the basement alone with only a lantern suggests initiative rather than command. Convincing his unit medic to spare a precious blanket for an American suggests persuasion and conviction rather than mere compliance with regulations. These were choices, not requirements. What makes Maurer's story significant is not that he acted uniquely. Thousands of medics made similar choices throughout the war. What makes it significant is that his choices have been documented and remembered. Most acts of battlefield compassion were never recorded. Soldiers who shared food, medics who treated enemies, guards who showed mercy, these moments happened constantly but disappeared into history's noise. Maurer's moment survived because Kovacs was haunted by it, because Henderson remembered it, because Bergman researched it, because Henderson's daughter wrote about it. The blanket itself no longer exists. Hospital records do not track what happened to linens used for patient transport. The blanket was likely washed and reused for other wounded until it wore out or was lost when the field hospital was evacuated ahead of Allied advances in early 1945. Or it might have remained with Henderson and been discarded when he received clean bedding at the POW camp. Physical objects rarely survive war's chaos. What survives are stories, and stories require someone to tell them. Henderson told his story to his daughter. Kovacs told his story to his wife. Mitchell told his story to his son, though briefly. Maurer told his story to the German medic who wrote the memoir. Each telling was incomplete and imperfect. Memory fades and distorts. Details blur. But the essential truth remained consistent across all versions. 3 American medics trapped in a basement. 1 dying. German soldiers who chose to help. A blanket that was the last one available. A young soldier who died days later. The Hürtgen Forest is quiet now. The trees have grown back, though they are not the same trees that stood in 1944. The ground has healed over shell craters and foxholes. The fortifications have been dismantled or hidden by vegetation. Tourists visit occasionally. Historians conduct battlefield tours. Memorials mark locations where specific units fought. But the forest holds no memorial for Maurer or for Henderson or for the basement where their paths crossed. This is appropriate. War memorials commemorate collective sacrifice and national purpose. They mark major battles and turning points. They honor the dead in aggregate. Individual moments of compassion between enemies fit awkwardly into this framework. They complicate the narrative. They suggest that even in war's worst moments, humanity persists in small actions that make no strategic difference but make all the difference to those involved. In 2015, Henderson's grandson visited Germany while studying abroad. He traveled to the Hürtgen Forest and located the area where his grandfather had been wounded. The exact location was uncertain. Henderson had never known precisely where the farmhouse stood. Wartime maps were imprecise. The landscape had changed. But Henderson's grandson walked through the forest anyway. He took photographs. He collected soil and pine needles in a small container. He visited Maurer's grave and left flowers as his mother had done 14 years earlier. While at the cemetery, Henderson's grandson encountered an elderly German woman tending a nearby grave. They spoke in English, which she spoke moderately well. She asked why an American was visiting this particular cemetery. Henderson's grandson explained about his grandfather and Maurer. The woman listened quietly. Then she said her father had been a medic in the Wehrmacht during the war. He had served in France and Germany. He had never spoken much about his experiences, but he had once told her that the hardest part of being a medic was not the wounds or the death. It was choosing who to treat first when there were too many wounded and not enough supplies. She said her father had died in 1988. Before his death, he had told her that he hoped he had made the right choices. He had treated enemies sometimes before treating his own side because the enemies were more critically wounded. He had given medical supplies to prisoners when German soldiers also needed them. He had violated regulations occasionally because regulations did not account for individual circumstances. He had died uncertain whether his actions had been correct according to military law but certain they had been correct according to medical ethics. Henderson's grandson asked if her father had known Mauer. The woman did not know. She provided her father's name and unit. Henderson's grandson later researched the unit and determined that her father had not served in the same division as Mauer. But the connection was still meaningful. Her father and Mauer had faced similar choices and made similar decisions. The specific details differed, but the underlying dilemma was identical. How to maintain humanity in inhuman circumstances. How to treat all suffering when resources allow treating only some. How to follow conscience when conscience conflicts with orders. Before leaving Germany, Henderson's grandson wrote an essay about his visit. The essay was published in a small literary journal focused on war writing. The essay described his grandfather's wounding, Mauer's assistance, and his own journey to understand what had happened 71 years earlier. The essay concluded with a reflection on inheritance. Henderson's grandson had never met his grandfather. Henderson died 42 years before his grandson was born. But the story had been passed down. It shaped Henderson's grandson's understanding of moral complexity and individual responsibility. The essay generated limited response. A few readers wrote letters to the journal. One reader mentioned a similar story about a German prisoner of war who had been treated by American medics and later wrote about the experience. Another reader questioned whether such anecdotes served any purpose beyond making people feel good about human nature. A third reader argued that individual acts of decency did not mitigate Germany's collective guilt or excuse the Holocaust. These responses reflected broader debates about how to remember World War II. The war was both a clear moral conflict between democratic civilization and fascist barbarism and a complex human event involving millions of individuals making choices under extreme pressure. Both perspectives are valid. Germany's regime was criminal and genocidal. German soldiers who fought for that regime bore responsibility for its survival. But individual German soldiers were also human beings capable of compassion and moral reasoning. Mauer's actions do not absolve Germany's crimes. They simply demonstrate that even within evil systems, individuals sometimes choose decency. Henderson's grandson did not respond to the critical letters. He understood the objections. But he also believed the story mattered because it was true and because it revealed something important about human capacity for moral choice. Mauer had options. He could have ignored the Americans. He could have reported them and let others decide. He could have done the minimum required by regulations. Instead, he risked his health and possibly his career to ensure an enemy received treatment. That choice meant something. The essay was republished in 2018 in an anthology of war writing. It appeared alongside essays by veterans from various conflicts discussing similar moments when enemies showed unexpected humanity. One essay described an American pilot who had been shot down over Vietnam and treated well by North Vietnamese civilians before being turned over to authorities. Another described an Israeli and Palestinian medic who worked together treating casualties during a border clash. A third described a British soldier in Iraq who received water from an Iraqi civilian during a firefight. The common thread across these essays was recognition that war creates conditions where normal human decency becomes remarkable simply because it persists against enormous pressure to dehumanize enemies. Mauer's story was not unique. It was representative. Thousands of similar moments occurred throughout World War II and every war before and since. Most were never documented. The ones that were documented matter not because they change history's grand narrative but because they preserve evidence of humanity's persistence.